I would now like to introduce Jonathan Schooler. Jonathan Schooler is a professor of psychological and brain sciences at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He received his PhD from the University of Washington in 1987 and then joined the psychology faculty of the University of Pittsburgh. He moved to the University of British Columbia in 2004 as a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Social Cognitive Science and joined the faculty at UCSB in 2007. Schooler's research focuses on topics that intersect philosophy and psychology, such as how spontaneous cognition, as an example, mind wandering, gives rise to creative insights, how fluctuations in people's awareness of their experience mediate mind wandering, and how exposing individuals to philosophical positions alter their behavior. He's also interested in the science of science, meta-science, including understanding why effect sizes often decline over time and how greater transparency in scientific reporting might address this issue. Schooler has been an author on over 200 scientific publications. Schooler's work is frequently featured in major media outlets such as the New York Times, Nature, Scientific American, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, the USA Today, The Boston Globe, Time Magazine, Psychology Today, CNN, Discover Magazine, and among many more. His work on creativity was recently featured on the BBC television show Horizon, and his work on free will on Morgan Freeman's show Through the Wormhole. I'd like to pass it over to Professor Jonathan Schooler now. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you,
and
Alana.
Thank you very
It's
much
a pleasure.
for being here today.
My sounds okay? So yes, it's really it's a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone is doing well, and I understand today is the first nice day in a very long time. So I'm very flattered that you've taken the time to join us. Today, I'd like to discuss an interesting tension between two concepts that have been around for a long time: mindfulness and mind wandering. And let me sort of begin by just reflecting on this time of reflection that during the pandemic, it really has been an opportunity for many of us to reflect. We're all sort of batten down the hatches, and this has given us an opportunity to sit and be with ourselves and think. And that has led to two different, there's a bird in the background here. It's been an opportunity to think, but at the same time, it's also an opportunity for distraction. As we are facing these various different threats of one sort or another, it's easy to become distracted by worries. So during this time, it gives us both an opportunity to appreciate the value that we get from being sort of left to ourselves, and also the challenges. So the relevance then of mind wandering is, well, first let me ask what is mind wandering? Mind wandering involves mental departures from the here and now, in which an individual is directed away from a task at hand. So when you're driving and you suddenly realize that you've driven past the exit or you've headed in the wrong direction, or an example that I particularly like is when you're reading and you realize that your eyes have continued to move across the page, but your mind has been fundamentally elsewhere. Research suggests that 25 to 50% of people's waking hours are spent mind wandering. So this is really a common thing that people find themselves doing, and it can be extremely costly. It's a source of distraction. I'll be talking substantially about the many ways in which mind wandering can be problematic, but it may also have value, and we'll be talking about this too. It may be an important source for creative daydreaming. So during COVID, it may really be almost like a test case for each of us to experience both the pros and the cons of mind wandering. So what do I want to accomplish in today's talk? First, I'd like to consider the question, to what degree is mind wandering a problem? How often and in what ways does mind wandering interfere with our everyday lives? Secondly, is there an antidote to mind wandering, and could that be mindfulness? Can the technique of training our mind and training our focus help us to overcome the challenges that mind wandering pose? Third, are there situations when mind wandering may be helpful? I've already alluded to the possibility that mind wandering may be an important source of creativity, and I want to consider the possible evidence for that. And then finally, if there is a good kind of mind wandering, are there ways to foster that good kind of mind wandering, and what might that be? Okay, so with no further ado, let me sort of plow into the first question. Is mind wandering a problem? So one place where there's a considerable evidence that mind wandering could be problematic has to do with mood. My good friend, the Harvard professor Daniel Gilbert, wrote a very important paper with his then student Matt Killingsworth that appeared in Science, one of the most highly respected journals in all of science, entitled, and I have to say, I think this is a rather unfortunate title, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And what they did is they had some 2,500 participants being pinged by their smartphone every several times a day, asking them what they were doing, how happy they were, and critically, whether they were focused on what they were doing or whether their mind was wandering. And the results were rather discouraging from the perspective of mind wandering. First off, here you can see this is how happy people are. Can you see my cursor there? I guess I can't. Let's see. I'll just. Okay, I'm getting a response. No, okay, you can't see the cursor. I'm wondering if there is. Oh, maybe this is the. Here's the pointer.
Jonathan, there's like an arrow beside draw. I think that's a cursor.
We got it. We got it. I think I got. I've found the pointer, but I can't seem to control it. Oh, I see. Draw. Okay. Let's see. There we go. Oh, there. Can you see that? Okay. Great. Cool. All right. So what you can see here is we've got the scale that goes from lowest, so 35. That's unpleasant to pleasant, and these are the different experiences that people are having. And what you can see here is that, and then the size of the circle is the amount of time doing the various different things, that the number of times that they responded in that state. And what you can see here is that people were happiest when they were making love, although it's a little peculiar that they were interrupting what they were doing to respond. And they were least happy in terms of activities, sort of in the working and resting thing. But the critical thing was happiness when they were mind wandering. And what you can see here is that people who were not mind wandering, they tended to be happier than even pleasant mind wandering, and neutral mind wandering and unpleasant mind wandering were markedly less happy. So the conclusion was that when people are mind wandering, they tend to be less happy. So in addition to being associated with poor mood, mind wandering is also associated with accidents. There was a nice study in which they went to emergency rooms and interviewed people who'd just been in accidents, and then they found out what they were doing right before the accident, and then also looked to see was it the person's fault or not. It's determined later on by insurance. So they could look to see what is the difference between the people who were at fault versus the people who were not at fault. And what you can see here is that so the larger the score is here, means the more the at-fault people were doing it relative to the not at-fault people. And so things that you might expect, such as alcohol use and negative affect. Alcohol use and negative affect were major determinants. But the worst thing, the thing that was most predictive of being at fault, was mind wandering when they were thinking of distracting content. So when you're really preoccupied when you're driving, that is a major predictor of being in an accident. So mind wandering, it seems, is actually a predictor of being involved in car accidents. So we've got mood, accidents, and the third one, there are other domains as well, but I think the third one is particularly interesting, is reading. And I mentioned this experience before where you're reading along and you suddenly realize that although your eyes have been moving across the page, your mind is fundamentally elsewhere. And the question is, what happens? What happens when you're mind wandering while reading? How does that affect your understanding of the material that you're reading? Well, in one study, we investigated this. We had people read War and Peace, and they read it on the computer screen. And as they read it, we asked them to indicate any time that they noticed that their minds were wandering. We had two different measures of mind wandering. One measure was what a self-caught one. So every time you notice your mind wandering, press the button. But in addition to asking them to report mind wandering, periodically the computer would ping them and go, just now was your mind wandering. And the question was, could we catch people mind wandering before they caught themselves? And what we found is that we routinely caught them, that routinely, even though they were in a study in which they were supposed to pay attention to what they're reading and supposed to catch themselves when they were not paying attention, routinely, we could catch them mind wandering before they noticed it themselves. And when we looked at the relationship between the frequency with which we caught people mind wandering and reading comprehension, what we found is the more often we caught people mind wandering themselves when they hadn't noticed it, the worse their reading performance was. So if you're mind wandering and you haven't noticed it, then that is a strong predictor that you're not really attending to the material and not extracting the relevant information. So this leads to a distinction which I think is quite helpful in thinking about mind wandering and actually thinking about consciousness more generally. So let me just take a moment and unpack what I think is a very helpful way of thinking about consciousness. And then I'll bring it back to this question of mind wandering while reading, and in particular, the difference between self-caught and probe-caught mind wandering. So the idea is that typically when we think about consciousness, we think about two levels. There is non-conscious information. That's all of the unconscious processing that's taking place below the surface of awareness. So all the processes that lead to the thoughts, the particular thoughts that come to your mind as opposed to other thoughts, all the things that lead to dreams and stuff that Freud talked about, all the stuff going on below the level of awareness. In addition, however, there's also, of course, the experiential consciousness. This is the material that you're experiencing from the time you wake up in the morning to the time you fall asleep at night. There's an ongoing stream of consciousness, of material going through this ongoing experience of experiential consciousness. Now, that's typically the way people think about consciousness, non-conscious or unconscious and conscious. But there's a third level that oftentimes gets overlooked, which I refer to as meta-consciousness or meta-awareness, and that's one's explicit understanding of the current contents of experience. So when you're mind wandering while reading, while you're mind wandering, you lack meta-awareness of the fact that you're mind wandering. You're just experiencing the mind wandering, but you aren't actually aware of the fact that you're doing it. Then you go, oh, I've done it again. I was mind wandering. Where was I when I lost track of what I was paying attention to? And that's the moment of meta-awareness. Coming back to the idea of self-caught and probe-caught mind wandering, the idea is that self-caught mind wandering involves mind wandering with meta awareness. So you press a button, you go, oh, I just noticed that while reading this book, I was mind wandering. I'm going to press the button. But the probe caught, where we ping you and go, just now were you mind wandering and you hadn't noticed it yourself, that's the mind wandering without meta awareness. And what we find in this study and in many other studies is that it's the mind wandering that we don't notice, the mind wandering that is snuck underneath the radar. That's the problematic one, because we don't know we're doing it, and it thereby interferes with our ability to correct, to go back to figure out what we missed. Okay, so if that's the case, then if we could find a way to knock out meta-awareness, we should be able to change the frequency with which we catch people mind-wandering versus they catch themselves. So how can we do this? How could we reduce people's meta-awareness and thereby see its impact on people's ability to, or tendency to mind-wander, and their ability to notice their mind-wandering? Well, there is a technique, and this is one that many people avail themselves of recreationally, and that is alcohol. Alcohol is known to impair meta-awareness. In fact, that's one of the reasons why people enjoy drinking it. People feel less self-conscious in social situations. They're less paying attention to what's going on in their heads, and so they are able to just sort of relax. So that's one of the reasons why people do it, but it also has significant consequences. So in this follow-up study, we basically replicated the reading study that I mentioned to you before. People are reading War and Peace. They're pressing a button every time they notice themselves mind-wandering, and we're also periodically pinging them and going, just now are you mind-wandering? The new addition, though, is that half of the participants are given a beverage with alcohol in it, a pretty stiff drink, and the other half are given a beverage that is a placebo. They think it has alcohol, has the smell of alcohol, but doesn't actually contain any alcohol. Interestingly, when you give people placebo alcohol, they can actually get pretty drunk. They start getting raucous and loud and laughing more. So these people, they all thought they were drunk, but only some of them had actually consumed alcohol. So what we found was that the people who consumed the alcohol, it increased unaware mind wandering. When we probed them, we were twice as likely to catch them mind wandering as the people who had not received the alcohol. At the same time, it reduced the likelihood of them noticing it themselves. So here they are mind wandering twice as often as people who were sober, and yet they're actually noticing their mind wandering less often. And I think this is informative, both in terms of another way of demonstrating that this meta-awareness plays an important role in mind wandering, and also illustrating the impact of what alcohol does to you. Why is alcohol so dangerous? Well, it packs a 1-2 punch. It increases the likelihood of lapses, so you're more likely to mind wander when you're on alcohol, but it reduces the likelihood of your noticing your mind wandering. So you can see how dangerous that could be, and another reason to really think twice about drinking and driving. Okay, well, let's get back then to mind wandering while reading. Another context in which we might think about mind wandering and reading has to do with gaze duration. So there's very interesting research looking at the pattern of eye movements as people are reading. Essentially, what researchers do is they measure where the eyes are looking as they are reading. And what you find is that there are some very systematic differences in gaze durations as a function of word content. More common words people look at for a shorter duration of time, where more unfamiliar words they gaze at for longer. Essentially, the idea is that the eye spends different amounts of time depending on how much processing a word needs. If a word is unfamiliar or one that you don't encounter very often, the eyes will look longer. If it's a very common word, the eyes will look less long. So the question then comes, What happens when people are mind wandering while they're reading? Their eyes are moving across the page, but they're thinking about something else. Does that affect the way that the eyes move? So the prediction is that if people are not processing the meaning of the word, then their gaze duration should be less affected by word frequency. And another finding is that people spend more time at the end of sentences to sort of integrate the entire sentence. So when people are mindlessly reading, we might expect this relationship between the content of the word and gaze duration to be different. And that's exactly what we found. This is a rather complicated graph, but I just want you to extract a very simple message from it. What you can see here is various different gaze measures, and you notice that a lot of these measures are correlated with the length of the word and its frequency. So what this is showing is that when people are reading, so again, we replicate the study. People read text, and we ping them periodically and ask them if they're mind wandering, and then we look to see what the pattern of their gaze durations were right before we pinged them. And when they said they were on task, what you can see here is that a lot of different measures were correlated with their gaze duration. But if they're reading along and we ping them and they say they're mind wandering, then what we find, and all you need to do here is notice far fewer correlations. When people are mind wandering, there is less of a predictive relationship between the quality of the words and the amount of time their eyes rest on those words. Their eyes essentially are decoupled from the meaning of the words and are therefore not reflecting the qualities of the words in how long they spend in it. So the pattern of eye movements when people are mindlessly reading, when they're mind wandering while reading, changes, demonstrating that they're really not extracting the meaningful content from the words. Also provides a potential way in the future of being able to figure out when people are mind wandering while reading and perhaps pinging them to bring them back on task. Okay, so we've talked about the costs of mind wandering, reading, mood, accidents, and I could tell you about other things. Not surprisingly, people mind wander a lot while they're in lectures. In fact, I hazard to guess that some of you are mind wandering right at this very moment. So ping, are you mind wandering? Let's move on and now ask the second question. Is it possible to use mindfulness as an antidote to mind wandering? And this is a question that my lab has been interested in for some time now, but it's not just my lab. This is an idea that goes way back in history. So mind wandering is an age-old problem. The Buddha, over 2,000 years ago, is said to have said, "Let the wise guard their thoughts, which are difficult to perceive, extremely subtle, and wander at will." So people have been observing mind wandering for some time, and the same tradition has also suggested that meditation, and in particular, developing the capacity to focus on the breath, may be a valuable technique for helping people to remain more focused. So this is a quote from a Taoist breath meditation where it says, "When one breathes in and out, one's concentration causes the generative force to rise. Count from 1 to 10, and then from 10 to 100 breaths with the heart-mind, following the counting to prevent it from wandering outside. When the heart and breathing are in unison, this is called locking up the monkey heart and tying up the running horse of intellect." So this idea of monkey mind or running horse, the idea that our mind is constantly running away with us, goes way back, and a long advised technique for helping to become more grounded, to remain more focused, is to focus on the breath. So what is the evidence? Is there in fact evidence that learning techniques of focusing on the breath can be helpful? And what is the relationship between mindfulness and mind wandering? So research has been increasingly demonstrating that mindfulness can be very powerful. Mindfulness has really become a highly studied domain, and that's something that we have been studying quite a bit in my lab. In one study led by my former graduate student who's now the director of research at UCSB's Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential, Michael Mrazek, we looked at the relationship between mind wandering and mindfulness. We gave people a measure known as the Mindfulness Attention and Awareness Scale. I'll show you some items from that in a few minutes. But essentially, these are questions about how often your mind wanders versus how often you are mindfully in the present. We then gave them a measure of mind wandering, and then we looked at how often they mind wandered when they were doing a meditation. And then we looked at some markers of inattention associated with mind wandering. One of them is known as the sustained attention and response task. Oops, let me back up here. This is one of the most tedious tasks you can give people. What they have to do is press a button every time they see a target, such as this O here, but if they see a Q, they have to withhold the response. So you say O, so you're just pressing the button, 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 button. If you mind wander, you could easily press the button with the Q as well. So this is a measure. If you miss, if you press the button when the target arises when you're not supposed to, that's a behavioral indicator of mind wandering. So what we found in the study was that our measures of mindfulness, the Mindfulness and Attention and Awareness Scale, were highly correlated with a number of different measures of mind wandering. So RT variability is how much variability was there in reaction time. More importantly, SART errors, so how often did they accidentally press the button when they were supposed to withhold it? That was quite correlated. And then how often TUD is task unrelated thought, how often did they mind wander during meditation, and how often did they daydream? The more mind wandering was shown on all these different measures, the less well they scored on the MAS scale. So showing that basically mindfulness and mind wandering are in fact opposing processes. That's encouraging because it means if we could encourage mindfulness, we might be able to reduce mind wandering. So in a second study, we did a very simple intervention. This is one that you all can do yourselves, and I advise you to try this given our results. We simply have them engage in a 10-minute mindful breathing task. All they did was to sit upright, relax, focus on their breath, and simply watch their breath as it goes in and out. And when they noticed their mind wander, they just gently brought their breath, their attention back to the breath. So we either had them do mindful breathing, passive rest, or reading. And then we gave them the SART task that I just introduced you to before, where they have to press a button when they see one letter and withhold the button when they see the other one, which is an uncommon letter. Or that is, they don't see that the target letters very often. The key thing to see here is that when they did 10 minutes of mindful breathing, it reduced the number of times that they made an error, the number of times that they accidentally pressed the button when they weren't supposed to, by nearly, cut it nearly in half. So what this suggests, and these were not experienced meditators, what this suggests is that a very, very straightforward mindfulness exercise can have immediate benefits in terms of reducing mind wandering. Quite encouraging. But can we train people to develop a skill in a more general sense of mind wandering less? In another study, again led by Michael Mrazek, we compared two different conditions. Undergraduates were randomly assigned either to a 2-week mindfulness class or a 2-week class on nutrition. Both of these classes provides the expectation that it's going to be helpful for performance. Then we, both before and after they participated in this intervention, we gave them 2 different measures, something known as a working memory measure, which basically examines people's ability to hold information in memory, and a reading task in which we gave people questions like were from the GRE and then tested their comprehension. For both of these tasks, we also measured mind wandering. For the working memory task, we measured mind wandering afterwards. We asked them, after they completed the task, how much had you mind wandered? And for the verbal reasoning task, we actually did very much the same way that we did in the studies I've told you about already, where we pinged them while they were reading and asked, just now, were you mind wandering? And what we found was that the mindfulness course dramatically improved performance on both the working memory task and on the reading task, and reduced mind wandering. So here you can see that that you get a improvement between pre-test and post-test performance on the reading task, but no difference between pre-test and post-test when they did the nutrition. Similarly, you get an improvement on working memory capacity in the mindfulness case, but not in the nutrition case, and you get a reduction in probe-caught mind wandering, self-caught mind wandering, and retrospective mind wandering in the mindfulness condition, but not in the nutrition condition. What this suggests, and indeed we had further evidence statistically showing this, is that the mindfulness training improved performance, and it improved performance in large part by reducing mind wandering. When people are mind wandering, they can't carry out the task as well. Mindfulness seems to be an effective antidote to this dilemma. So in another study, again led by Mike Mrazek, this was really quite an ambitious study. In this study, we wanted to see how much could we change performance across a number of different domains, including mind wandering, but also other areas as well, and including mindfulness, but also including other elements as well. So we did 3 different studies. These were quite intensive. They involved 6 weeks of an intensive, multifaceted training, and this training included 5 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. So it really included quite a substantial amount of commitment from our participants, and it contained meditation, yoga, exercise, and instruction. The way we did this study is people were randomly assigned to either the sit condition or what's known as a waitlist control. So they did either the sit condition or the waitlist control for 6 weeks. And then those people who had initially been assigned to the sit condition then got to do it time as usual. And those people who had been originally assigned to the waitlist got to do the sit. So everyone got to do the sit, but at the first pass, only half the participants did it. The others just did life as usual. We gave everybody a whole bunch of different measures before they participated in the intervention, and then after the intervention, and then again after everyone had received the second round. So those people who did not get the intervention the first time, they got it the second time, and then they got the measures yet again. But the key question is, what's the difference between the individuals who received this intervention versus the waitlist control between the time they were first tested and after they received either the intervention or the waitlist control? So this next slide is very busy, but the major point is pretty straightforward. Here you can see the different measures that we used, and what we're graphing here is the difference between the waitlist control and the sit condition, this intensive transformational experience. And what you can see here is that on measures of health, we got very large effect sizes on a number of different measures. Cognitive measures, increased task focus, increased working memory focus, These are large effects. Increased reading comprehension. No difference in creativity, and remember that because we'll come back to that. Massively improved mood, reduced stress, reduced mind wandering, greater sense of self-efficacy. And I don't have time to show you this, but we also scanned their brains and looked at the relationship between different networks of the brain. And essentially what we found was that when people had received the SIT training, they had greater connectivity between the insula and the sensory motor areas. So the regions that are associated with monitoring the self and with attending to external experience, greater connectivity there and less connectivity between those regions and something known as the default mode network, which is a region that tends to be activated when people are mind wandering. So we found changes in functional connectivity that seem to reflect these improvements in performance. It's also useful to see what people had to say about these experiences, and I'm quite proud by some of these testimonials. One said, "This was the best thing I've ever experienced." Another said, "I came in as a skeptic, and I certainly didn't think I would change my life in 6 weeks, but I learned to take control of my mind, and it's made me happier, stronger, healthier, and more focused." Another said, "This program gave me the tools to achieve things I've only dreamed about. It is truly one of a kind." A final one said, and there were actually more, but the last one I'm going to mention here, "I can't even put into words how grateful I am to have been part of this program. It taught me how to make the most of this one life. I will never forget this experience." So really, a very powerful demonstration of the impact that an extended mindfulness training, when complemented with other elements, can have on people. I should say that we now have a Center for Mindfulness and Human Potential here at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and we are developing what we're calling the Mindfulness Education Initiative, a digital high school mindfulness course that we have now introduced into high schools around the United States, and we'd be interested in collaborating in Canada too. So if any of you know high schools who would like to have a mindfulness course, a digitally based mindfulness course for their students, we'd be happy to share it with them. This course runs on multiple platforms: their iPhone, their computer, their tablet. It's interfaced with teachers, so teachers can track their use. It involves high quality video instruction that gives them the basic principles of mindfulness. And it has a very innovative element, something known as daily beats, where they listen to music as they meditate. And an important element of this as well is that they can customize it. We have daily beats in a variety of different genres. And also the musicians themselves introduce the daily beats and provide descriptions of how mindfulness and meditation have been helpful for them. So it provides students with the opportunity to sort of have people who they respect give testimonials about the value of mindfulness. So we really think that this is a very powerful technique for enhancing focus and reducing mind wandering in schools. And indeed, we've done a number of studies now that suggest that students are mind wandering less as a result of participating in this program. Okay, so far we've talked about mind wandering being a problem. We've talked about mindfulness being a solution. Now I want to switch to the question, is mind wandering always a problem? Are there situations in which mind wandering might actually be helpful? And here I'd like to suggest that one place in which mind wandering might be helpful, here we have, you can sort of think of the absent-minded professor with his mind in the clouds, is in creative ideas and insights. As I mentioned before, one place where we didn't really see a powerful relationship between mind wandering and between mindfulness and performance was with respect to creativity. And we actually have some evidence that mindfulness has a little bit of a complicated relationship with creativity. Let me back up for a second and mention that there are two different routes to creativity. So here is, you can try to think of this up for yourself. Bored, magic, and death. What word is a common associate of all three of those words? Well, the answer is black, blackboard, black magic, black death. And the question is, how did you come, if you did solve it, how did you come to solve it? There are actually two different ways that people can solve these kinds of problems. One way is analytic, where you just simply power it out, thinking through all the different possible associates of each one of those different words. And the other is insight, where you just stare at it and boom, the idea occurs to you. And in this study, we were interested in seeing what is the relationship between people's ability to solve these kinds of problems and mindfulness, and then furthermore, how does that relate to whether they solve it analytically versus insight-based? This is the mindfulness attention and awareness scale that I mentioned to you before. This was our measure of mindfulness. Has items like I break or spill things because of carelessness, not paying attention or thinking of something else, and so on. So we gave them that, and then we gave them the remote associates, a number of different items like the one I just showed you. And then in addition, we asked them to indicate if they solved it in a analytical or insight way. And what we found was that the relationship between mindfulness and creative performance on this remote associates task depended on the way that they solved it. For people who were high in mindfulness, they tended to do better when they were doing it in an analytic way, as opposed to when they were doing it in an insightful way. Whereas for the people who were low when people were solving it in an insightful way, they tended to do better when they were low in mindfulness. Putting that another way, it seems that mindfulness seems to facilitate analytic solutions, but actually interfere with insight solutions. So it seems that sort of this scatterbrained, mind-wandering kind of way of thinking may be helpful for having insight solutions. At least that's what this study suggests. So we've also looked at examples of mind-wandering and creativity in the literature, and there really are numerous ones. I'll just mention a few. There's a classic example of Archimedes, who was trying to figure out how to calculate the volume of the king's crown without having to melt it down. And he was taking a bath and then suddenly realized, eureka, if he puts the crown in water, he can displace its volume by seeing how much water is displaced, and thereby figure out the actual volume of the crown without having to melt it down. Rumor has it that he got out of his bath and ran through the streets of Syracuse naked, being so excited. This is one of the first examples of this sort of aha experience, but there are others. Poincaré, in discovering the solution for Fuchsian functions, described it as follows. He said, at the moment when I put my foot on the step, he was getting on the bus, the idea came to me, without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it, that the transformation I had used to define the Fuchsian functions were identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. Essentially, he's just mind-wandering, steps on a bus, and boom, the solution to this problem comes to him. Towns similarly comes up with a solution for laser. Accordingly, it goes, the idea of the laser beam dawned upon the physicist Charles Towne while he was sitting on a park bench in Washington, D.C., admiring the azaleas. He suddenly realized how light could be configured to a very pure form. This was early in the morning of 26th of April, 1951, when he was on his way to a conference. Many examples of people just sort of carrying on their everyday lives, and then boom, mind wandering, and some important solution comes to them. So it seems that sometimes just letting one's mind wander can be quite helpful. So there have been many observations from anecdotes. We were interested in examining whether we could investigate this in a more scientific way. I should also point out that it's also associated with these aha experience, just as the eureka experience that Archimedes reported. So In this study carried out with my colleagues, and in particular Shelley Gable, we had a number of different individuals, writers and physicists, and in both cases, we asked them to keep a daily creativity journal for 2 weeks. Each day at the end of the day, we asked them if they had any creative ideas that day, and then if so, what was the context under which they had the ideas, and then we also asked them about if they were actively pursuing the problem or if they were doing something unrelated to the problem. So we call this spontaneous task independent mind wandering, or STIM, and that would involve doing something unrelated to work, such as paying a bill, as well as thinking about something unrelated to the general idea or problem. So here they are, they're, say, paying a bill or in the shower, not necessarily thinking about the problem that they're working on, and then boom, a solution happens. And what we found is that 20% of the ideas that people had occurred under this classification, where they were basically spontaneous task-independent mind wandering, not at work, not actively pursuing the problem. When we looked at the quality of these ideas, there was no overall difference in the creativity of the ideas that happened while they were working on the problem versus the ones that happened in this more spontaneous mind-wandering way, which is kind of remarkable if you think about it. It's remarkable that the work that you do when you're at your desk is no better than the work that you do in the shower. But more interestingly, we found that the ideas that people had when they were mind-wandering were almost or even more than twice as likely to involve overcoming an impasse as those ideas that happened while they were making steady progress on the problem. And they were more likely to involve aha experiences. So this study then demonstrates that these mind-wandering ideas, the ones that happen when you're not actively pursuing the problem, sometimes can be particularly helpful in enabling one to overcome impasses. So what's going on here? We suspect that there may be two things that are useful for this creative, this beneficial kind of mind wandering. First, that it entails curiosity. We know that creative individuals are more likely to mind wander about ideas they're interested in. I'll come back to that in a second. And secondly, something known as the Zygarnik effect, which is that Zygarnik was a Russian psychologist who discovered that people tend to actually remember problems that they failed to solve better than the problems they successfully solved. When you fail to solve a problem, it creates an impasse, which leads you to think about that problem later on. So our idea was that people may benefit from a certain kind of curious daydreaming. So we did a study, Claire Zadalis, a postdoc, actually a research scientist working with me. We asked people about different kinds of content for their daydreaming, including the daydream revolved around an unfinished task or project. I daydreamed about an intriguing question that I'd yet to find an answer to, and the daydream led to the solution to a problem or question that had previously stumped me. So how often are people mind-wandering about this sort of curious mind-wandering? And then we related it to two different measures of creativity. The creative behavior inventory, which is more everyday kind of things, such as arts and crafts pieces, writing plays, songs or poems, painting, sculpting. And then the creative achievement questionnaire, which involves publications, having a gallery show, more significant creativity accomplishments, and then correlated in both of those cases that with the curious daydreaming scale. And what you can see here is a quite significant for a psychological study correlation between curious daydreaming and creative behavior, as well as creative achievement. So with regard to our third question, are there questions when mind wandering may be helpful? The answer is yes. It seems to foster creative insights, and particularly when it's curious mind wandering. And I'd like to introduce the idea of what I'm calling mind wandering, which is what we're calling curious mind wandering. It's the idea that there's a particular kind of mind wandering where you're thinking about things that are especially interesting, as I mentioned before, when you're thinking about things that are problems that you're really curious how to solve and so on. And we've already shown evidence that this mind wandering may be associated with creative performance. And interestingly, it seems also to have some of the fewer negative sides to other kinds of mind wandering. As you'll remember from the beginning of this talk, in general, when people are mind wandering, they're less happy than when they're on task. Well, we replicated that basic finding, but with a twist. In addition to asking people, were they mind wandering, we also asked them, how interested were you in what you were mind wandering about? And what you can see in this slide here is that in general, when people were off task, they were, as Gilbert found in the past, less happy than when they were on task. So yes, mind wandering is associated with an unhappy mind. But when people were mind wandering about something they were especially interested in, mind wondering, they were actually happier than when they were on task. So curious mind wandering seems to both promote creativity and also facilitate mood. How can we foster, how can we cultivate this curious mind wondering? Well, we're still just at the beginning of this, but one idea we think may be very valuable is cultivating openness to experience. Well, what is openness to experience? Openness to experience is one of the known as the big 5 personality dimensions. So it's one of the major dimensions on which people differ. It involves being creative and open to new ideas. There are a number of different aspects of it, including fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, ideas, values, actions. And I have a very active imagination, so it's very closely related to daydreaming. But it's very interesting when you look at the relationship between openness to experience and other metrics. You can see that there seems to be some real value to openness to experience. Individuals who are open to experience show, as I've already mentioned, greater creativity. There's evidence that it's associated with greater creative career advancement, metacognitive advancement, intellectual humility, curiosity, and even some evidence that individuals who are open to experience live longer. And this makes some sense. As people get older, they tend to lose openness to experience, whereas openness to experience is sort of like childlike wonder. So if you can keep that sort of young at heart, you may actually live longer. So the idea, well, before saying that, of course, there are also downsides to openness to experience. It's associated with daydreaming, which, as we've already discussed, can lead to a distraction. And also, you want to be cautious in what you're open to. For example, being open to skydiving without a parachute would be a very bad idea. So the idea that we've been thinking about currently is again, the sort of middle way idea to merge the cultivation of openness to experience with the cultivation of mindfulness, which we're referring to as open mindfulness, where you are cultivating openness to experience along with mindfulness, and together you may get the benefits of both worlds. You get the creativity of openness and the awareness and discernment of mindfulness. How might we do this? How might we cultivate mind wandering and open mindfulness? Well, we're still working on this, but some of the things that we think may be useful is listening to new types of music, essentially engaging in novel experiences where you learn to appreciate the value of doing different things. I know this is COVID time, but you could listen to new music. Try reading a kind of book that you haven't read before. Try a new recipe. Think about topics that you haven't thought about before. So on the one hand, cultivating doing new things that you haven't done before, and on the other hand, learning to meditate. One final thing that I'll mention in this vein is that my partner has been developing these very powerful musical experiences that are aimed at cultivating both openness to experience and mindfulness, where you listen to a very sort of novel, almost psychedelic type of sound experience, and at the same time listening to it while in a meditative state, where instead of using the breath as the ground for your experience, you use the sound, letting your mind essentially focus on the sound as it moves almost three-dimensionally through space. I encourage you, if you're interested, to go to amandagregory.com with your headphones and try it out for yourself. You'll actually find there an example where I do an introduction for it, and then you can experience the way in which having this novel experience may sort of open you up in ways that you may not have experienced before. And it's our thesis that engaging in these kinds of experiences over an extended period of time may indeed foster open mindfulness. Okay, well, so in conclusion then, I started with a number of different questions. To what degree is mind wandering a problem? And the answer is it is a significant problem that can impair performance in many domains, including reading, mood, accidents, attending to lectures, really countless ways. Any time in which you need to be focused on what you're doing, if you're mind wandering, it can be problematic. To what degree is mindfulness a solution? We have a lot of evidence now that mindfulness is a real antidote, not just because it relaxes you, but specifically because it helps you to maintain your focus and fosters your meta-awareness, your ability to appreciate that you are mind wandering and catching yourself. Are there situations where mind wandering may be helpful? Yes, we don't want to necessarily always be locked into the present. Daydreaming can be very helpful in terms of fostering creative insight. So we need to make sure that we find time for letting our minds sort of have free play. And how do we foster this? Well, we want to foster not any kind of mind wandering. I think worrying about COVID is not going to probably be very helpful for facilitating your creative advances. But mind wandering about things in which you're curious about, issues that you are still trying to come up with a solution to, may be very helpful, as may be open mindfulness, where you simultaneously try to cultivate openness to experience and appreciation for new things while also cultivating mindfulness and discernment. All right. I'd like to close by acknowledging my many collaborators, both colleagues, graduate students, and grant support. And with the time remaining, I'd love to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you didn't mind wander too much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a very interesting talk. So like Professor Jonathan Schooler has said, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat box and he can address those or any comments that you have. But Jonathan, I thought maybe I'd ask you some questions if that's okay. So how do you think the pandemic has influenced people's tendency to mind wander?
I think it's really interesting to think about how this change in our daily lives has affected us. I think that it probably has influenced us in a number of different ways. First off, it's given us this major thing to mind wander about, and I'm afraid that it's unlikely that or that some of that negative mind wandering really may be problematic, just worrying about things all the time. So it's a distraction, constantly worrying about the possibility of getting ill or the possibility of being exposed. But at the same time, I think it's interesting to think about how many people are now taking the time to sort of step back and think about their lives, think about the things that they have always wanted to accomplish but haven't. Think about ways that they might want to change their lives moving forward. So I think it may actually have also encouraged some really valuable mind wandering that may lead people, when things get back to normal, to really make some positive changes.
Yeah, that sort of actually leads into my next question I was going to ask. because you mentioned that curious mind wandering can be beneficial. So, in the context of the pandemic right now, how would curious mind wandering, or mind wondering, as you call it, how could they cultivate that in during the pandemic?
Well, one thing that's really been that I've been enjoying is having the time to listen to podcasts and documentaries and various different areas of interest that I really just didn't have the time to explore before. So by participating in examining and learning about topics that you're interested in, that then gives you food for fodder or fodder for thought, where you can really think about those ideas. So hopefully after this talk, people will mind wonder about the ideas that I've discussed here today. So by feeding the imagination new ideas, that can provide it with ample types of ideas and
That's
thoughts
interesting. I
for
mean,
productive mind
because of
wandering.
the pandemic, we're trying to do our best and we're offering all of these, activities like singing and drumming. And so, in a way, you're suggesting perhaps, because you mentioned openness to experience, this might be a good time to try things during the pandemic that maybe you might not do otherwise to prevent yourself from obsessing and worrying during the pandemic.
Exactly. Exactly. So by trying new things, it gives you the opportunity to sort of think about new things that you may not have thought about before, and to really cultivate an attitude of wonder. Think about a young child, how much excitement they get from all sorts of different things. I think that as we get older, sometimes we become cynical and less excited about new ideas. But some of us learn to keep that childlike wonder. And so I think this is really an opportunity to think about those questions, maybe questions that as a kid fascinated you, and re-exploring those questions, discovering new ideas. There's so much, so many fantastic different domains to be curious about: science, arts, music, literature, so many different topics where you can really fulfill curiosity. And by really whetting that appetite for curious information, I think that it gives some really powerfully
I see
helpful,
that
productive
Susanna
things
has
to mind wonder
made
about.
a comment that I think is sort of a question as well. She says, I concentrate on breathing when my mind is wandering, I think she means, preventing me from falling asleep. So I guess when we're trying to cultivate mindfulness, you might be saying that it can also prevent you from falling asleep, if I'm interpreting that correctly. Do you have any comments on that?
The way, yeah, absolutely. So the technique that I started off talking about today of focusing on the breath is a very, very powerful technique and useful in all sorts of different contexts. One way it's very useful is to cultivate the capacity for focus, where you learn to really sort of hold your focus on the breath. And that's a key element of mindfulness. But another technique that it's very useful for is to help oneself fall asleep. You may find that even mind wandering, even the exciting kind of mind wandering, can be problematic if you're trying to get to sleep. You know, you just saw this amazing documentary and your mind is racing with all sorts of interesting things about it. Great, except for not so conducive to sleep. So to help to sort of get the mind more settled, if you focus on the breath and then just gently release thoughts when they come up. So the idea is you notice your thought, acknowledge it, and then just release it and go back to the breath. Excuse me. That can be a very useful technique for helping oneself fall asleep. Essentially, letting the mind sort of settle down a little bit and drift off into sleep. So I think that's what Suzanne is getting at, and I think she's using a
Right.
very effective
And
technique.
Lars has a question. Do you know of any online mindfulness courses or resources?
There are a number of outstanding ones that I would recommend. Two that I particularly recommend is Sam Harris's course, Waking Up, and the other one is Headspace. Those are two good ones. There's also one by Dr. Judd, um, which particularly focuses on the curious element of mind wandering. So that's also
What
one
about
that I
Eckhart
recommend.
Tolle?
Yes, an
Jonathan,
insight
does
timer
Eckhart Tolle, are
has a
you
number of
familiar with
helpful
him?
points
Does
also.
he also do mindfulness?
Yes, Eckhart Tolle has a wonderful book that I highly recommend called The Power of Now. It's based largely on his own experiences, but it's really very thoughtful. He makes the really important point, which is that there's actually a shift in perspective that comes with mindfulness. When people typically listen to the voice, the chatter in their head, they think, oh, that's me chattering. So they identify with the speaker. And what Eckhart Tolle points out, and I really think this is a great point, is that in fact, you are the listener. You're witnessing that chatter. You are not necessarily the author of it. Oftentimes, things cross through our head that we don't even necessarily really endorse. And so when we shift our perspective to, rather than identifying with the speaker in our minds, to rather to being the listener, it makes it much easier to embrace a bumper sticker that I think really is very profound and captures one of the key elements of Eckhart Tolle's wisdom: don't believe everything you think. So just realize that when some of that nasty stuff comes through your mind, that just because you heard it in your own head doesn't mean you have to endorse it.
I also had
And
a
that makes
question.
it
I
easier
mean,
to let
certainly
go of
there
it.
has been a proliferation on the use of social media and technology and mobile phones. So I'm curious, what impact do you think the introduction of mobile phones and social media has had on mind wandering, and perhaps now during the pandemic, because we're having to adapt and use it even more to connect with people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible to underestimate the impact of those technologies has had on society and even on our own cognition. I think the impact is variable. As I mentioned in our talk, we are developing, and others have as well, uh, mindfulness-based apps. So it actually is an opportunity to make mindfulness available to the general public in a way that it never was before. Also, it makes the availability of information for positive mind wandering more available. At the same time, it may be interfering with our tendency to engage in mind wandering. It used to be that when you had some idle time, you would just be left to your own devices. You'd think to yourself, you'd reflect and maybe have insights. Now, every spare moment, people are picking up their phone and doing an email or reading something. So it may be interfering with people's productive mind wandering. So I would encourage people to recognize that sometimes you don't need to fill every spare moment with that phone or that tablet. Take some time just to let your mind drift
Thank
into
you.
interesting
Kate has
directions.
a comment and a question here. She says, hello, thank you for your time today. One question I have: sometimes when practicing mindfulness, overwhelming feelings or sensations arise. what do you recommend for new people who are practicing mindfulness and having more sensation or thoughts arise?
Yeah, well, this is uh, a real challenge of mindfulness, mindfulness practices. And uh, there are a number of different things that one can do in that situation. One thing to do is to, rather than to get allow oneself to just get completely overwhelmed by it, to just curiously inspect it. Just go, oh, I'm experiencing these interesting, powerful emotions. What do they feel like? Where do I feel them? What happens when I closely attend to them? Oftentimes, it's a little bit like being scared of the boogeyman under your bed. When you actually pull out the flashlight and look under there, there's nothing there. And when you inspect these experiences and just stay with them, uh, oftentimes they will just sort of naturally dissolve. So I would encourage Kate to investigate those experiences with
Thanks,
open-minded
Jonathan.
curiosity.
Kate, I hope that was helpful. Very interesting answer. And we have a question from Marianne. She's asking, have you found a relationship between the availability of dopamine and capacity for mindfulness?
Um, we're actually doing a study right now, it's quite impressive of Marianne to ask that question. We're doing a study right now to investigate that question. The idea is that when people are engaging in a particular kind of a mindfulness, and this is known as open monitoring, and in open monitoring, you watch, rather than focusing on the breath, you just watch ideas cross your mind. And one of the things that we think may happen when individuals engage in open monitoring mindfulness is they'll get a little surprise as one thought crosses their mind and another thought crosses their mind. And those surprises, when people experience a moment of surprise, that can lead to an increase in dopamine. And there's also some evidence that, in contrast to the focused awareness meditation, which does not seem to be associated with creativity, open monitoring does seem to be associated with creativity. And so we're hypothesizing that open monitoring open monitoring meditation may be associated with a particular marker of dopamine that may be predictive of creativity. What is that marker of dopamine? It's actually eye blinking. When people are experiencing more dopamine, their eyes blink more often. So we're doing a study where we're looking at open monitoring, meditation, the frequency with which people blink, and then the relationship between that and their creativity.
And she says that question actually came from Maurice Theron, who is here with me. It's a good question. Um, Jonathan, is there evidence that it is possible to increase people's openness to experience?
There have been a number of, typically, well, openness to experience is considered one of the big five personality traits. And the other ones being, let's see if I can get them, introversion, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And typically, those are considered to be rather stable, although you do see some changes over the lifespan. For example, as people get older, they become more agreeable, more conscientious, and less neurotic. So a lot of positive benefits of getting older. The one personality trait that sort of goes in the wrong direction is openness to experience. But in general, people consider these personality traits relatively stable, so that makes them challenging to change. Nevertheless, there is evidence that they can be changed. There's some evidence that psychedelics can lead to enduring changes in openness to experience, but of course, many people wouldn't want to do that. But other things that seem to be helpful, there was a study that just came out where it was an app where people were essentially doing something known as implementation intentions, where they make a plan that in a particular situation they'll do something that has an intention to it. So every day after I walk the dog, I'm going to do something new that I haven't done before. And that study found that just 2 weeks of following that implementation intention plan of doing something new at a particular time led to significant increases in openness to experience. So it does seem that practicing engaging in novel experiences, novel rewarding experiences, can lead to changes in openness to experience, quite excitingly. Are you still there? Let's see here. Alana, you may be on mute.
Can you hear me now? Hello? I wasn't on mute, so I'm not sure what happened there. But I was just making the point that, yeah, that's an interesting point that you make about trying new things, because once I do try something new, I always feel good and happy about it, and then that kind of triggers me to want to do it again. Can you still hear me? Okay, good.
Yes. Yeah, I think that what it may be sort of the secret to enhancing openness to experience is finding novel experiences that you find rewarding. Once you learn that novel experiences are rewarding, then you'll seek out new novel
And
experiences.
one other question here. Why do you think open mindfulness is such a good quality to promote?
Well, we're excited about it because I think that openness to experience is a very valuable trait, but it can go too far. If somebody is too open to experience, they can be reckless. They can lack discernment in terms of what they're being open to and what they're not being open to. So it's important to temper that openness to experience with some real wisdom. And that's where the mindfulness comes in, to help people really pay attention to the present and making sure that they're making wise decisions about what to be open to. Mindfulness is, a wonderful trait, has so much value, but I think when taken to the extreme, it can be a little rigid, a little strict, a little dogmatic. And so the openness to experience element makes it more curious, more playful. And so the combination of the two feels like it may really be sort of a best of both worlds, each complementing each other and making and compensating
Great,
for the
thank you
possible
very much.
limitations.
I don't see any more questions in the chat box. Don't see anybody typing. So perhaps we can wrap things up if there are no more questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, it was a real pleasure. I do really encourage people to try to find the aspect of what I mentioned that's meaningful for you, perhaps trying a mindfulness course, perhaps trying doing new things, perhaps engaging in some kind of mind wandering. I think that just being attentive to the way in which the mind wanders, the remarkable things that can come to mind, being attentive to what we call meta-awareness, to noticing when your mind wanders, to noticing when you may have been distracted in a way that was disadvantageous, that in and of itself can be of great value. So I'm hoping that each person can extract for themselves the lessons that I mentioned that are most relevant to them.
Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your, I'm sure, very busy schedule.
Glenn, I can't hear you again.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it's cutting out. You can hear me?
Yes.
I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule, I'm sure, to speak for us today. It was a very interesting talk, great learning pieces there that I think people will find useful at this time. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy your sunny afternoon. And as we said, a recording of this will be available on the website probably next week if you wanted to review it again. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.